ministry is risk is a staple of the diet. It's like investors that every day work in risk-reward ratios, and so taking risk is just it goes with the territory. And sometimes you win and sometimes you lose. One of the risks that immediately comes to mind when you ask that question is risks that we have taken by entrusting responsibility and responsible positions to people who had addictions. And sometimes they relapse. And that can be particularly in positions of responsibility, that can be very damaging to the ministry. And so the most dramatic one, not serious one, but dramatic one, was one of our lead drivers who had picked up a whole truckload of brand new coffee makers that we were going to sell in our store, a real treasure. And the temptation was just too much, and so we caught sight of the truck all over the city that weekend as we were hunting for him, as he was selling those out of the back of the truck and on quite a high. So I would say it's colorful risk taking, and sometimes it evokes less than holy responses.
I think the biggest risk that I've ever taken was leaving the ministry. What Rick just shared about his family certainly applies to mine. My great-grandfather was a pastor who, at 3 or 4 points in his life, had to take a break because he had exhausted himself. My grandfather died of a heart attack at 62 because he never took a vacation because the devil never did. My father crashed and burned at about age 40, and the doctor said, if you don't change the way you're living, you're going to be dead within a couple of years. And he didn't. He stayed in the ministry, but succeeded in changing enough that he lived till age 92.
Wow.
But at about age 39, I hit the wall and knew that if I didn't do something drastically different, that first of all, my marriage would be over, my family would be finished. And so I took a leave of absence. I packed up my family in New Jersey and moved with a U-Haul trailer to Southern California. And it was probably the best thing I did. And I knew at the time, I was talking with a pastor friend in LA who said, you know, Howard, I think that God is asking you to lay your ministry on the altar. And if he chooses to give it back to you, then that's his work. And I think that was, I'm sure, the best thing I ever did, even though it was probably at the time seemed like the greatest risk.
I think the devil has lots of demons and takes lots of vacations by himself. I can't support that theologically. It's just a personal belief. So it's that elephant. I guess I built a whole lifetime around ministries of doing new things and taking risks. So in some sense, I don't know what to highlight. But I'll tell you what I lose sleep over. It's not failure. It's not money. It's not if things we do implode or whatever. The thing I lose sleep over is that we put staff in dangerous situations. We sent Kate up into St. Jamestown by herself into places where the police told her we don't even go. Our staff at Evergreen go to work every day knowing there are guns in the building. I send people to places where they are physically and emotionally and spiritually at risk. That's that's the thing I lose sleep over.
Similar to Bob, I think the risks that I face every day is taking calculated risks and trusting people who've proven repeatedly to be not so trustworthy. Because I'm convinced God intends them to do more for His kingdom. Yeah, co-workers and boss, in a sense.
You really don't want to out anybody?
We're not asking for names.
No.
Just an example.
Well, I mean, I would have to explain a bit more about what City Gate Leadership Forum is. We exist essentially to help direct service providers do what they do better by working together, and therefore I'm entirely dependent on them staying with the program they've assented to. And often that is, things get in the way. Sometimes those are in their control, sometimes it's not.
No, I'm just...
And, sorry, just because
Just
I
like
did
pension book.
Okay.
just because I did mention coworkers and boss, I want to not name names, but explain that what makes people really good at what they do usually makes them not so good at the other stuff they try to avoid that is in their job description. So it's not a knock, it's part of human life, and they could say the exact same thing about me.
Okay, moving on from risks, we're going to look at, I think one of you mentioned failures. Could you identify, another transparency moment, could you identify for us one avoidable failure that you have experienced in your ministry, hoping that we can perhaps avoid it completely? One avoidable failure that you have experienced in your ministry. Start with Rick.
Oh, thank you.
For no reason at all.
The key word is avoidable. Failure is easy. I worked for a gift school a number of years ago, and they fired me. And then they hired me, and they fired me again. That was avoidable. And then they offered me a job again, and I said no. That was smart. And that's true. But that's not very helpful. I think the avoidable stuff is for me, is when you get excited about something and the vision begins to take shape and there's money available and you run too quick and you don't do your homework. And I don't mean a business plan. You haven't done your ministry plan. You haven't thought through your philosophy of ministry. You haven't done the homework on it. And then you go charging ahead, probably full of vision and half committed. And then it blows up in your face and you leave. I'm fairly convinced that where you go, you should never leave until the job is done, even if you fall on your face. But I believe that you can avoid falling on your face by not running just because you have the money.
Without incriminating or anything, could you give us an example of that?
Yeah,
in your ministry?
I was charged with starting a mission in St. John, New Brunswick. We had the money, we had the post-church support, and I was hired to start it, even though I told them I was only around for 6 months on my way to seminary. I ended up staying 2 years. The ministry futzed around for a few more years after I left, and ultimately died because, in the end, there were no commitments, there were no plans, there was no expertise. None of us knew what we were doing. We chased all the wrong rabbits, and in fairness to all the other people who followed me in that ministry, it was stupid on my part, and they all inherited at the point when I couldn't do anything but die. Fair enough? Is that big enough?
Do you want to skip it over? Yeah, that's right.
The thing that's avoidable, thinking that it can get done this year. Trying to respond to requests from colleagues in the field to develop online resources for them to share what they've learned and to basically collaborate. For some reason, I can't recruit free webmasters.
Nobody can.
Listening to Rick talk, my mind flashes back over. It's been 40 years now, and I have flushed a disproportionate amount of kingdom resources down the tube on enterprises that I have started that just didn't
So
have.
support us, not him.
Enterprises that I was so excited about, but didn't have much of a business plan, and frankly, because I thought it was such a good idea, didn't need a good business plan. And I added up the number of those little or larger enterprises some time ago, and there were 34 of them. There are 3 that have survived. My most exciting one was a wooden shipping pallet manufacturing company that would create jobs in my community. And I rented out a warehouse. I bought a guy out who was operating this company. We had money and operationalized that, hired a bunch of guys from the neighborhood. And it was pretty much disaster from the word go. We knew nothing about manufacturing shipping pallets, but one of the problems that we didn't account for was, what do you do with all the sawdust when you saw these things up? And so the sawdust was stacking up everywhere, and we were using half of our workforce shoveling sawdust into 50-gallon drums that we had to pay to get hauled away. That wasn't in the business plan, such as it was. And so one of our brilliant staff said we ought to have a big vacuum under the saws that would suck that stuff up and blow it out into a dumpster where they could haul it away, which sounded like a very intelligent move. And he worked a couple of weeks to hook up an industrial strength vacuum system. And when we flipped the switch on, it was like blowing flour in a saucer. Just a mushroom cloud of sour oak dust rose up over our community and started floating across. And he said, "Shut it down, shut it down." We finally got up to peak production, where we were losing only 5 cents a pallet, and finally concluded that we would not be able to make it up in volume. And so we went out of business. I think a principle, though, that came to mind about an avoidable failure, that wasn't avoidable, that was going to happen no matter what. An avoidable failure was one where in a community development project, developing some real estate in our community, we came in as servants to the community and subordinated our decision-making ability to the neighborhood association, the politics, local politics. And so we did deals that obligated us for lots of money without realizing that if the politics turned against us, the community could fire us all from their board, and we would have no capacity to deliver on commitments to foundations, corporations who are putting literally millions of dollars into investments in the community. and the worst happened, and we got caught in the crossfire of some ugly politics in the community, found ourselves fired from the board, and all of the commitments that we had made to folks that trusted us, we could not deliver on. That was a very, very painful learning experience. And what we learned is you never subordinate your ability to fulfill commitments to community politics. That's it.
Yes, absolutely.
Just another word about failure. I think that we often fail because we're afraid of failure. And failure is not a big deal. You can't do this stuff without failing. And very early on, I don't know whether it was Bill Leslie or Bud Eichmann out of Chicago who said to me, the real test in the community is will you stay after you fail?
Yep.
Because the community expects that you will fail. They've watched all kinds of people come in before and fail. And then they leave. And so the issue becomes when you fail, the avoidable failure is leaving. When you fail, stay.
Yeah, one of my big influences in my life, a man named Gilbert James, who way back ultimately started the organization that had resulted in Scoop. But Gilbert James told me, he said most ministers fail because they don't know how to deal with failure. And I think that is a lesson, as Rick just pointed out, that you cannot survive in ministry if you can't deal with failure. And the failure that probably haunts me the most to this day was early in my ministry when I was in Brooklyn, and the church building was over a century old. Actually, believe it or not, my great-grandfather had finished building that building in the 1890s, and I came almost 100 years later, and the building was in unbelievably bad condition. And even though we were still very small and struggling, we set out to do a total remodeling project on the building, and found an architectural firm who were Jewish, but who loved our building and said, we would love to work with you, and they offered us a tremendous deal to do all the plans, get everything approved. The lay leader in that church was a very, very successful illuminating engineer, internationally known, very well connected in our denomination, a very, very strong person. But one day we were on a trip actually to an urban conference, and on the way home he said, Howard, I don't think we should go with this firm because they're Jewish. And he said, I know that you have the votes to win this. But he said, if you insist on going in the direction that you think we should go, he said, I will oppose you and I'll split the church. And I regret to this day not calling his bluff. That was an incredible moment of leadership, and I failed. I said, okay, I don't think we should do that. I knew that he was wrong, and I knew that I was right. And what happened afterwards was a disaster. The Lord was faithful, and the building was rebuilt and stands to this day, but not near as good as it would have been if we had gone with that Jewish architectural firm. And I don't think he would have split the church. I think if I had stood up to him, I think he would have backed down. And I think, kind of what Rick was saying, the greatest source of failure is often our fear of failure, and I allowed him to intimidate me, and I didn't do what I knew in my heart I should do.
You wanted to hold on to the mic there. James, do we have bottled water? I Excellent. Could somebody bring some bottled water up for our speakers? I should have done that. I failed to do that. So I'm just going to